I was working on poetry for 25 years. I mean, I'm not going to not take this opportunity. But we were both pretty worn out after finishing this book.
Okay. Yeah.
Because, I had, should we go down that road, talking about the book?
I think whenever we get the signal that Ernie's ready.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. We're ready.
And when we engage with these characters in Game of Thrones, we'll remember them when we're under pressure. I mean, I know it works for me. When I'm under pressure, I think, hey, dude, this is a time to be like Tyrion when he listened to Lord Varys and he went to Meereen. Or I'll say, Bruce, this is a moment where have the courage of Arya. She doesn't know how she's going to make it through this, but this is, and so these metaphors are within us, and they're easy to access, and what I've attempted to do in this book is connect them to very important applicable ideas. So to me, the power of leadership through fiction is that it's easy to access, it connects us with brilliant thought leaders, and it gives us tools when we're under pressure to choose to win and not die. When I saw the pilot of Game of Thrones, I thought, oh, yeah, I could totally get into this, and I said to my wife, Sherelle, I said, let's watch it. And she goes, no, this doesn't work. We're not watching this. And I go, come on. She goes, no. So then a couple months later, this editor reached out to me from a small business press in New York, and he had tracked down the fact that I taught this class, Leadership Through Fiction, at Columbia Business School. So I was teaching a class at that point. I've been doing it for 3 years, that linked novels, plays, and films to leadership ideas. So he came to me and said, listen, I'll give you a contract right now if you want to do that to Game of Thrones, that take that same concept and write a Game of Thrones book. And instantly my wife and I both got excited by the idea. We didn't end up signing a contract with him because of some constraints on the publisher he was with at the time.
Okay.
But I started going down the road of talking to different people about the book, started writing chapters. Long story short, at the end of 2017, he came back to me. He was at a new publishing company, Macmillan, and he said, look, I want to give you a contract now. Do you want to take it? And I said, yeah. And he goes, well, here's the trick. You got to write it very fast because the show's going to end, in 2019. So all of 2018, I was just working on it like crazy when I wasn't teaching, but I was teaching all the time,
Right.
So I would find this window of free time and I would power out some chapters and I would send it to him. And by July, I really didn't have much that he'd actually okayed. And we were supposed to finish it in July, right? So I'm in New York teaching, and my wife Sherelle is saying, how are you going to do this? And she's, financial person by training, chartered financial analyst, very rational, very kind of grounded. And I grew up studying poetry, and my first novel was, a road trip novel about a guy in LA chasing a porn star out to Palm Springs. My background was a little more creative, right?
Yeah.
And most of my friends are like actor, film, musician types. And I said, I don't know, I'm going to get it done. It's going to happen, And she's like, what do you mean it's going to happen? And I was like, it's just going to happen, right? And inside I'm thinking, God, dude, you got to get this thing finished, right, somehow. And we ended up finishing the first draft sometime in September. So I was just powering out chapters. But at that point, it had been percolating, and I had written versions and versions and versions of things, and I'd really been living it internally for like 4 or 5 years. So finally, at one point, I just said, this is that moment where it's got to come together, right? And I would send the editor these 50-page chapters, and he would just redline out 25 pages and then send it back, right? And I didn't even argue. I was like, you're the editor, brilliant. And I just hit accept, And I said to Sherelle, like, it would be a lot easier if I wasn't writing twice as much pages that he was, cutting, but this is our process, and let's just go with it.
Right.
And so we got it done on time. Then I had to go back to New York to teach, and she said, being, again, a very grounded, person, she goes, I'll go through and double-check all your footnotes. And I had about 500 footnotes, and I had done them as rigorously as I could in this craziness of writing, but then she had to go through and really cross-check everything. So the two of us, by the time we finished the book at the beginning of this year, finished everything, and I'd finished the audio. So they invited me to do the audio. By the time I'd finished that, we were just both wiped out. And then that started then the time when it was time to promote the book.
There's another marathon.
Yeah, and that's also when this editor came out of Oklahoma and said, I want to publish your poetry. And we had been graduate students together years ago. And I said, well, that's exciting. You know, I spent a lot of years working on that. Let's do it. And Sherelle's like, no. I go, what do you mean no? She's offering me, she's going to publish my poetry. She goes, no. And I said, honey, there's no footnotes. Nothing. You don't have to do anything.
Yeah.
Just don't worry about it. And so then this year I got all caught up in the promotion of it, which was pretty exciting.
Yeah.
I was on the stage at the Harvard Club with one of the executive producers of the show.
Of Game of Thrones.
Yeah, of Game of Thrones.
Fun.
And I had just finished teaching a block week course to executive MBAs, which was my leadership through fiction course. And a block week means it's 5 days, 8-hour days. You teach a whole term in that period of time. And they do some prep work in advance, and they do some follow-up work. But basically, you're doing it all in 5 intense, 40-plus hours of teaching. And the book came out that week. So the school provided them all copies of it. It was pretty exciting. And then I was going on this stage the next week at the Harvard Club. And so we're up there. It's me, this executive producer, who's just a really cool guy, an interesting guy, and we're talking. And one of the people in the audience, said, Professor, who do you predict? Because none of these episodes had started yet for the final season.
Right.
And the person goes, well, who do you predict is going to do best in the final season? And I had made this firm kind of internal commitment. I'm not going to start predicting things. My book's more about connecting leadership ideas with the stories. It's not about sort of this whole internet obsession with trying to predict things, and it's not going to play.
Everybody
to my
get on the
strengths.
message boards.
Yeah, exactly. I go, it's not. People are going to be better at that than me, and But there I am on the stage, right? And they asked me, and so I looked at him and I said, "You should ask this guy, this gentleman. He created the show, but of course he couldn't answer."
Right.
So I said, "Look, it's going to be Sansa." And then people said, well, why? I said, well, she's been learning all the time through all these horrific experiences. She doesn't have kind of a specific skill sort of beyond her knowledge and her sort of inherent capacity to develop wisdom. And my guess, I said, if I just had to guess, is that she's going to do very well in the next season. And then once I'd kind of staked that in the ground, I was interviewed by like an AP journalist and different people, and I was saying, it's going to be Sansa, and because, I am an adjunct professor at Columbia Business School, journalists, it just got picked up everywhere.
Right.
So suddenly it's like in the Hindustani Times, and it's just everywhere. Columbia professor says Sansa Stark. And then I was asked to do, little articles and videos talking about it. And at one point, I was getting very stressed out because I thought, God, I hope Sansa does okay. I hope she doesn't just
You're really hanging your head on that.
Yeah, I kind of went all in on it. And I was also thinking, I think Braun's going to do well too. And I'm like, no, I'm just standing right here with this.
Yeah.
And she did okay.
Yeah.
So it was an intense thing to promote the book, but it was a lot of fun because people just cared so much about the characters.
Totally.
And then it was a way for me to bring these leadership ideas that, you and I were talking before we recorded about this, how you need to keep optimism in your life and how you need to be able to be resilient and not quit when you've faced some adversity. And that's always been a big thing I've brought to teaching senior executives and graduate students, because my chosen career, in addition to working at a business school in executive education, was being a creative writer. And here we sit literally in Hollywood as we're talking, and as well as I do that that's a tough road, both in the publishing industry in New York, in the entertainment industry in LA. You've got to go out there and create something and devote everything to it, and then usually you're doing that on spec, and then you need to go find someone to pay for it after you've gone through years or whatever it's taken to get it done. And so in terms of my kind of experience to senior executives and to MBA students, it's often been, you've got to lead yourself through that.
Right.
You can't expect some outside force to support you. You can't even expect, honestly, your romantic partner to support you.
Sure.
I mean, you've got to find, you can't expect your friends. I mean, hopefully they all will support you at certain moments, but you got to find a way to do that.
Right.
And for me, I'm kind of going a little bit off in one direction here, but with Win or Die, it was a way to just say, let's bring all of this that I've learned from different professors I've listened to, people I've read, things I've experienced, and try to give that back to people to help them be as successful as they can be.
Yeah.
You know, and it's been fun.
Yeah, and ambitious too. You've got
Yeah.
your personal stuff. You were citing top psychologists, the research, but
Yeah.
then you had it all layered over the work of Joseph Campbell as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That was initially a sticking point with the editor, Stephen Power. He wasn't convinced that was going to work. And I said, look, I think it's got to have that moment in there because it's the mythological piece, it's kind of the spiritual piece. And then to his credit, because I think it does layer it with more complexity, and to his credit, he embraced it. At one point he said, good, I like what you're going to try to do with this. And it did.
For those who don't know, what's
Yeah.
what's sort of the link there with the hero's journey and the
thanks.
leader's journey?
Joseph Campbell was, well, in the early part of the 20th century, he was a Columbia student. He raced track. He played in a jazz band. He was going to be a graduate student in the English department, studying like kind of the King Arthur period and sort of ancient or older English literature. And then he went to Paris at the time that James Joyce was publishing his work. He met an East Indian philosopher on the ship over to Europe. And that gentleman was kind of talking about East Indian philosophy. And by the time he came back to Columbia, he had decided that he wanted really to branch out from just one specific focus of English literature to kind of a broader multicultural, multi-religious study. And I don't believe there's anything at that point at Columbia, or they weren't going to give him money to do it. So he went up to Woodstock, and he just lived off money he had made as a jazz musician. And he started writing all these different publishers and saying, do you have sample books in religion, in different cultures around the world, in mythology that I can read? And back at that time, they would mail him these books. So he just read and read and read. And then he wrote this book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which is really an effort to find commonality between the world's myths and to find this sort of thread through them. Many years later, George Lucas was stumbling through, or attempting heroically to get through creating the script for Star Wars. And he had studied Joseph Campbell, I believe at USC, and he went back to The Hero with a Thousand Faces and was reading it, and that's where he got, some of the ideas for the Force, for a religious, for a kind of a spiritual power that would come and help the hero. That's where he got the idea for the hero having to want to resist the call to action, but then choose the call to action. So, of course, Star Wars transformed the film industry, and then screenwriters in the late 80s and early 90s started seeing this hero's journey idea as a useful blueprint for screenwriting.
Totally.
Right? So it started bubbling up in everything, this idea that the hero or heroine is being called into something that puts them at risk. They hesitate from doing it. Then they realize they need to do it. So in Star Wars, that would be when Obi-Wan Kenobi says to Luke, you need to go and be a Jedi. And Luke says, no, I need to go home and help my step-parents bring in the crops.
Right.
And then he goes back, and the stormtroopers have slaughtered his step-parents, and then he realizes, I've got to go on this journey, right? So you leave on the journey, and you enter this foreign world. For Luke, that would be very clearly when he first walks into the jazz bar,
Yes.
on Tatooine,
Yeah.
and they're all, and he meets Han Solo and everything. I mean, in a different way, in Game of Thrones, that's what happens to Ned when he goes back to King's Landing. Is he initially hesitates accepting this call down to be the hand of the king. He and his wife, Caitlin, I think they rather kind of hurriedly decide it's the right thing to do without a lot of evaluation. But he does go down there. He makes the decision to bring his daughters, which is pretty questionable. But he's entering this foreign land much in the way that Luke was entering a foreign land. And so for me, and to get back to what we were talking about writing the book, to try to use that blueprint or map all the way through the stories was going to be a challenge, but I felt it was also going to give a structure to it that would be exciting, that would help people when they were reading it think about their own hero's journey.
Right. So how do you get people, you teach it's the advanced management program at Columbia?
I have two core jobs, which as an adjunct, I teach in the MBA and executive MBA program at Columbia Business School. So I'm teaching graduate students. My fundamental kind of probably core job is co-running the advanced management program, which is a senior executive leadership program. And in that I teach, a lot of what I do is help run the program, but I do have certain sessions I teach. And so one of them is called The Hero's Journey. And it's about really facing adversity, preparing yourself to face adversity. And so I've been doing that now to different groups around the world for 12 years. But in AMP, what they're doing is they're writing a story where they're envisioning a challenge they're going to face. And they're using a modified version of Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey to write that story. And the idea is that, okay, you're sitting there at this executive camp, you're incredibly successful, you're a managing director or a vice president, you're doing very well, and next week, next month, 6 months into the next year, something's going to happen. And how do you prepare yourself for being ready for that?
Right.
And so what they do is they envision what that challenge could be, and then they put themselves in the position of Luke Skywalker or of Ned Stark, and they write how they're going to handle it. And a lot of it is around how do you handle your own internal doubts and your insecurities? How do you try to evaluate a landscape, a contextual situation that isn't easy to understand? Ned Stark, went into King's Landing and was very quick to accept Robert Baratheon's rather simplistic judgment of people. He said, "Oh, they're flatterers and fools." He didn't act as if there were anyone there that was important. He kind of dismissed them all, and Ned went in pretty much having accepted that approach, and it put him in a very vulnerable position because there were people in King's Landing who could have been his allies. And Lord Varys comes to mind, and instead he partners with Peter Baelish. So a big part of the hero's journey is recognizing who are your allies, and then and often, and this comes up in the story writing workshop, hero's journey that I do with the executives and with graduate students. What often comes up is people realize they need more allies. Right. And I know that happened to me at a certain point. I thought I need more allies. Wait, I need to be proactive about trying to find more allies. And that's a big aha moment for a lot of people because they realize they can do more to make those connections happen.
Absolutely. This narrative story for hard experiences, that's also an exercise that you put in the book as well.
Good for you.
Are you when you're writing this, are you kind of taking the big themes of your courses and then trying to give those to people so that they can have that kind of experience too?
Yeah, so thanks for that. So exactly, the Hero's Journey workshop that I teach, I put that in one of the chapters here. My goal initially, and what I feel really good about with the final product of the book, is that I have benefited from being in the back of class, listening to these brilliant professors from Columbia Business School. I benefited from being in the back of class, hearing professors reference a certain writer in some field related to leadership, say Seligman from Wharton, psychologist on sort of optimism. I read his work, I guess about 9 years ago, and it was critical at helping me recognize I need to continue to apply. So I've done some of this inadvertently, but I need to be more proactive and more intentional about doing this, right? So when I went to the book, a lot of it was, when I went to create it, I thought, this is my one opportunity. I don't know if I'm going to write another leadership book, right?
Sure.
This is my one opportunity to try to bring everything that's helped me and that I've seen help executives and MBA students. Because often when I'm sitting in the back of class at the advanced management program, I'm watching some brilliant professor deliver content on persuasion or on strategy, and I'm then sitting with these executives from all around the world later, and we're having a glass of wine, and I'm hearing them talk about how important those ideas are. And then I'm doing follow-up coaching with them. So 6 months later, I'm on the phone with them, and I'm recognizing, and they're telling me straight out, here's how I applied, Professor Bontempo's idea on persuasion, or here's how I applied Willie Peterson's idea on strategic learning. So my goal going into this, which I was very explicit to myself and to Sherelle, my wife, was I've got to find a way to make this really land. Mm-hmm. And it's got to land also for the professors who might not even know Game of Thrones. In fact, let's just assume very few of them do.
Sure.
Right? But I'm going to give them the chapter after I've written it, and I want to know that they feel good about it too. Mm-hmm. Right? Like if they don't feel good about it, then I've failed. Mm. And so there were, I would say, about 3 or 4 people in here, maybe more, actually 5 or 6, that when I sent the chapters to them, and again, there wasn't a lot of time. Certainly wasn't a lot of time to do a lot of rewriting. When I sent them these chapters, I thought, man, please like it. Because I think I've given it everything I can, and I would be happy to kind of sit and spend another year tinkering with it, but I don't get to do that, right? And all of them came back to me with very, they'd give me some notes or
Sure.
some ideas. Be sure to remember this, or
Right, my 2009 paper on X.
Yeah, I wasn't given tons of research to go, but more like, remember this. Don't
Okay.
miss this point, right?
Okay.
And I got a lot of, enthusiasm that I think you've captured it. So that for me probably mattered as much as anything. That I thought, okay, because this can't be. I've been around leadership for 30 years. Mm-hmm. I've been involved teaching it. But it doesn't all need to, in some way, be channeled. I mean, it's channeled through me in the sense that I'm creating it. Mm-hmm. But what I'm really trying to do is bring together the brilliance of George R. R. Martin, the HBO team, the showrunners, everyone that created Game of Thrones, the brilliance of these Columbia professors, the brilliance of other people that I've read. I'm trying to bring this all together and have it be catalyzed in a new way.
Right.
And that was what motivated me. Mm-hmm.
What made it
and link it with Joseph Campbell.
Right.
Yeah. So.
I'm wondering, what motivated you to make the big change from you were in like a fine arts program doing poetry, and now you are a leadership consultant and a professor at Columbia Business School. Where did that turn?
Doesn't that just seem like a normal? It doesn't seem like a normal path.
Every day.
Yeah, everyone does that. In the really early, like 1990. I mean, I got out of graduate school in '87. Mm-hmm. I was working on this novel, which ended up getting published, Fast Sofa. It was a Generation X novel set in L.A., road trip out to Palm Springs. We ended up getting a film made with Jennifer Tilly and Jake Busey and Crispin Glover, all wonderful people and talented actors. And but anyway, I was working on the book initially, and I needed a job. Mm-hmm. I was temping different places, doing kind of this half-assed, waiting and a little bit of bartending on campus at Columbia, and then a friend of mine said I could get you some work at least temporarily at Columbia Business School. So I walk in there with really long hair and a goatee and like cowboy boots, and I was like, point me to whatever I'm supposed to do, and I thought I'd be there for a week, right? Yeah. And they put me in some back office, and I was, filling out triplicate forms on like a, typewriter. I mean, it was very archaic. And then on my own, I was working on the novel. Mm-hmm. After so I was at least bringing in a little bit of money, and I was living down the street in an area that at the time, it's all been gentrified now, but at the time it was called Heroin Alley. It was very, very lively. And then my boss at the business school, a really inspiring woman named Marianne Devanna, came to me and said, Bruce, we have an opening, and I'd like to, promote you to this role of associate director and give you what's, really a job, like a real job, and I think you could be good at it, and I think you'd learn, and I think you'd enjoy it. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. No, I'm like a writer. I don't think you really understand. That's just not my thing, the whole business school. And she gave me this, almost maternal look, and she said, Bruce, you're 28. You need a job, And so I said yes, and I started working in the field. And within, I'm not exaggerating, within probably weeks, I was just hooked.
Yeah.
You know, I found the work fascinating. I was often at these upstate in this beautiful old mansion at these executive education camps, leadership camps. So I was engaging with all of these people from different cultures, which was something that really resonated with me. I was helping them. I was around a lot of brilliant people, you know, hearing their ideas. I was very quickly put in positions where I was either selling the program, so I was traveling around the world, again, meeting people, being in different cultures, trying to help people. And at one point, I remember some of my friends at the time, people I'm still friends with, were sort of saying like, oh, you know, what happened to you? You know, you kind of used to be kind of this cool artist, and now you're this guy walking around in a suit. And I said, yeah, it's exciting. You know, I like it, right? And I went through a period of kind of internal tension. Like, am I selling myself out, right? And at one point I thought, look, you're writing almost every night after you work. You're doing everything you can to get your stuff, you know, created and finished. And you also find this other work interesting.
Yeah.
And then later, as my life kind of developed, I realized that work it probably saved me, because it allowed me, I could work hard, whether it was poetry, film writing, or novel writing. I could immerse myself in it, and I could also just let it go.
Yeah.
And I could go, now let's go do something that has immediate impact. I get a paycheck. I see other people being positively affected by it. You know, so it ended up making sense, but it's a great question, because at the beginning, to me, it felt completely counterintuitive. And I just went with my enthusiasm.
Right.
Which, to tie it back to Joseph Campbell, one of his big things was saying all of us have to find, he used the word bliss, you know, we have to find where we get our bliss, and then we have to pursue that. And if you do, doors will open, connections will be made, unpredicted things will happen. But if you don't have the presence of mind or the courage to step in and embrace things, none of that other stuff can unfold.
Right.
And so for me, at a certain point, I realized, God, you know, I initially thought that was probably a questionable call, but later that path I went on was unique, and that's been an advantage.
Yeah. Yeah, this taking action, this like stepping into it, answering the call, it's huge. And the title of the book, Win or Die, and the famous phrase in the show, I may mess it up, but it's, you know, when you play the Game of Thrones, you either win or you die.
Yeah.
And that would seem a false dichotomy. Like, well, I could play the Game of Thrones and win or die, or I could step back, I could take a break.
Right.
Like, I don't have to do this.
Right.
And you mentioned the story of Tyrion showing up in a box with air holes.
Yeah.
That would seem like a good time to opt out of the game.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
You've been through a lot, dude. But
Yeah.
but there's so much to this pushing into it anyway.
But can't, you know, yes, and it would be, could Tyrion have just opted out?
And that's the thing. It seems that there's really something about the human spirit and a pursuit, even when it's dangerous,
Yeah.
that's so important.
Yeah.
Can people opt out? What happens?
To me, the person, and again, I feel this way a little bit looking at people I've known in my life too, is that the people that have pursued aspirations may have got knocked down. They may have suffered for it. And yet at the same time, they've found purpose. And the people that step back and go, it's too hard, well, then what are they committing to? I mean, to me, I can apply it to my own life. There was some time early on with Columbia Business School, I'd say in the 90s, when I had a different role. I had kind of become plateaued with the work. I wasn't particularly interested in it, and it was very repetitive. And I was trying to just get through the day to then find something else that interested me, which in my case was writing. But what had happened was suddenly, whereas I had once been in a really challenging role that had been very ambitious for me and required everything, and then suddenly I was in what felt like a, quote, easy role, but it was really, for a while at least, kind of empty. And I realized this just doesn't, it's not easier for me. It's demotivating, right? And it's kind of sapping the life out of me because I'm not being challenged. And then I went back, and this is 15 years ago, I went back to the school and said, listen, I need something bigger or I have to go, right? And I think in Game of Thrones, what you see with all of the admirable characters is a hunger to go find what they need and fight for it. Whether it's literally Arya, you know, going to the House of Black and White and fighting, you know, fighting the waif and, you know, eventually killing her, but proving that she can, training herself, or if it's Sansa simply surviving, but with the the motivation to eventually help the people of the North.
Right.
So I don't really believe you can I think it's I think what you can do is step back and pause.
Okay.
Right? I think you can say, whatever your pause method is, whether for me, it's hiking in the desert, it's meditation. When I was younger, it was going out every night.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, whatever it is, I think it's good to have that, right? Because if you don't, I think, you've got to be able to enjoy the process. And now, granted, maybe the analogy with Game of Thrones falls apart a little bit because they weren't maybe always in the process because it was pretty rough. But there were times even with Arya and even with Jon Snow where you felt in the middle of a violent, dangerous, demanding environment, they were enjoying it.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
the Hound is enjoying, his approach to things. And I do think in everyone's career, and this is something that I feel pretty strongly about, is you have to find a way to enjoy the process. Because at the end of the day, the achievement, I was thinking about it driving in here from Palm Springs with my son, the achievement of the book is a wonderful thing. But the achievement doesn't sort of, the writing of it is exhausting and it's a challenge, but you need to enjoy that part too. It can't be, well, eventually I'll be done. Because I think then you hit that moment and it feels a little empty. But if all the way through it you're like, this is exciting, that's a good place to be. There's a professor at Columbia who's a good colleague, was a great colleague, he's also a great friend of mine, Paul Ingram, and he talks about how one way to really sustain happiness is to have aspiration and to pursue challenges. And once you've completed a challenge, to then decide what's the next challenge.
Right.
So maybe there is that pause. He says this often to graduate students when they're finishing their degree. Celebrate whatever it might be, a week, 10 days, and then decide what's the next thing you're going to do. And I know I apply that to my life.
Absolutely. Yeah, and the celebration piece, I think there must be something about like the brain chemistry of it, that if I do the thing, I also give myself the dopamine or whatever comes when I celebrate, that I think really serves people. Like I had friends in the military going through flight school who, when we'd finish a big test or a big flight or something, they wouldn't celebrate. They'd be like, no, I'm going to be a jet pilot. I got to get back to work. And I roomed with a guy like that, and he ended up failing out.
Yeah.
And I don't know that's one off, but I think that there's something about letting yourself have a little fun that does keep you going.
Yeah, I don't have any research to agree or disagree, but intuitively it makes a lot of sense to me because I think you hit those moments where you've given, it's a way of recharging.
Yes.
Right? And I think it's also a way of, in many cases, connecting with people and getting outside of yourself for a little bit, right? So I don't know about your roommate, but my guess is that if he had let himself enjoy for a bit, it could have you're kind of seeing your life in the eyes of other people.
Yeah.
Right? You're learning, in a way, you're kind of learning from people at that moment
Yeah.
and building up for then when it's time for you to focus again.
Right. Absolutely. So somebody who has lots of fun in Game of Thrones is Tyrion.
Yeah.
What makes him so smooth? What makes him stand out and keep getting through?
I think he's got a very strong ability to empathize with people and to understand them. I mean, early on when he tells Jon Snow, embrace the fact you're a bastard.
Right.
I mean, he's saying, look, that's how I've had to approach my life, and he's seen commonality. He could have looked at Jon Snow as just some, unimportant, unimportant kid that was related to someone his father probably wanted. He chose to care.
Right.
Right? And so I think all through the story, when he defends Sansa in front of Joffrey, he's choosing to care about people and he's choosing to empathize with them. And at the same time, he's got humor. He can diffuse really tense situations. Like when Shagga of the Hill Tribes, tells him, Tyrion, son of Tywin, how do you want to die?
Right.
And he says, in bed at 80 with a bottle of wine, et cetera, et cetera. And,
I remember the rest of that line.
Yeah. And he's got a way of connecting with people through that. And I think where it goes off track for him a bit with Tywin is that, and even with Cersei, to be fair to both of them, is that he doesn't understand how he is perceived by his father and by his sister. He doesn't see that and I'm not defending their approach to him, but he doesn't see that he's playing into this negative role of kind of a whoremaster jester, right? And to 85% of the people in Westeros, that's a charming thing and it's funny and they don't really care. But
Right.
to these people who are very status conscious, who are in his family, they do care. And he continues to try to either joke his way through it with Tywin, or he's even less effective when he demands Casterly Rock from Tywin because he says, "I'm your son and I should have this." And his empathy, his ability to understand people breaks down with Cersei and Tywin. And I think it breaks down in the same way that we all often face that within families and within dynamics with people we really care about, because he wants to get something from them. He wants them to approve of him in a way that he doesn't otherwise normally care about, right? And then, of course, it gets compounded by the fact that they want to execute him. And then, of course, it gets worse, but he escapes and he gets to Pentos. And I think where he is helped again into this, to answer your question of smoothness, is when he goes to Daenerys in Meereen. He's very aware that she has all the power.
Right.
Right? He knows she has all the power. I mean, she could simply, at her whim, just have him executed or thrown back into the fighting pits. And he's got the courage to travel there, to find the purpose, and to basically say to her, "I have something to offer you." And he confronts her with courage, and she sees it. And again, if she was Walder Frey or King Joffrey, she'd probably have him executed anyway. But she's got her own, particularly at that moment in her professional career, she's got her own empathy. And she looks at him and she realizes, hey, this guy's a truth teller. And, until she sort of spirals out of control, that matters to her. Truth teller is the thing she really cares about. She wants it from Tyrion. She wants it from Varys. She knows she needs that. And so I think, to get to Tyrion, I think he's got an ability to read people and to empathize with people.
Yeah.
And that helps him a lot. And that actually would help all of us.
Yes.
Right? It's something that we can, we can take that message from Tyrion.
Yeah, and you made a really interesting point about how it breaks down with the family, too. And I wonder, if we are close to people and we feel like we're having trouble reading them, how can we get better at that? How can we get better at empathizing with those who are close to us?
Yeah.
But I see this a lot in teams.
Yeah, and I think one approach, one approach is to really try to look more rigorously at your, I don't know if flaws is the right word, but try to look more rigorously and clearly at how you could be perceived. So probably when I was younger, I wasn't I was probably a little like Tyrion, right? And in my early days in the Columbia Business School, I presented myself as this, loquacious, witty writer who kind of understood everyone and was always fun. And there were professional reasons for doing it. It was also a good fit to my personality. And at a certain point, I was also wondering, why aren't more people taking me seriously, right? And because I took myself seriously, and I worked very hard, but often what I was presenting to people was this very lighthearted version of myself, right? And when I was working on the book, I was thinking back to that time, and I thought, wow, I was doing a lot of what Tyrion is doing with, with Cersei and Tywin. I was doing that in my own way a bit early in my career at the Columbia Business School, because it was important to me for some reason to appear as if I cared, but I didn't care too much, right? And I don't exactly know why I was doing that, but I know I wasn't actually paying attention to the fact I was doing that. And when I looked at Tyrion and when I was writing the book, I thought look, let's not assume that if he did one thing right here or there, Tywin would suddenly embrace him and Cersei would suddenly love him and everything would be good. I mean, they're verging on psychopathic.
Right.
Joffrey is psychopathic, but the other two are certainly. Tyrion was going to have a rough road either way. But if we want to extract learning from it for ourselves, one of the things Tyrion could have been more effective at doing with Cersei and Tywin was thinking about how they wanted him to act and then controlling and managing himself to do that to be more effective. And I think all of us can do that in our own life. And I know for me, when I was writing the book, I looked back at certain points in my life, I thought, yeah, I kind of played to a role because it sort of pleased some people, but I didn't realize that it also allowed other people to judge me, right? And so I think there's a takeaway there for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Bruce, you talked a ton about emotional intelligence in the book. What do you want people to know about emotional intelligence through the lens of Game of Thrones?
I remember it was in the 90s when the book Emotional Intelligence came out, and I was listening to a professor give a talk about it, and this light kind of went off, and I thought, God, I think I kind of have that, right? I was whatever, in my early 30s, and this Daniel Goleman's work, I thought, this might have been a thing that helped me, right?
Yeah.
And I remember I went up in this mansion where we were running our programs. I went up to my room, and I took out all these PowerPoints and ripped them apart and kind of taped them around the walls. And then I got the book, and I started reading it and highlighting it. And I realized this was a skill that I had, and I didn't even know I had it. And it's a skill that I probably let drift away because I wasn't purposeful enough about it, right?
Sure.
And when I talk to groups about EQ, which I'm doing more and more, a lot of what I'm trying to encourage people to do is recognize that whether you intuitively are good at, or instinctively are good at this, whether this is an area you want to grow, ideally, I think even if we're instinctively good at it, we should all want to grow in it. Recognize that you can be more purposeful about this. I mean, you can, self-management self-understanding, self-awareness is a big part of it. There's a lot more we can do to try to be clear about understanding ourselves. And then once we understand ourselves, self-management is a big part of it. What can you do? I do more consciously now to self-manage than I've ever done in my life. I mean, I got up yesterday to give essentially do some virtual teaching around the country from my house in the desert. I mean, I went to bed thinking about how I wanted to be in the right frame of mind. I got up and went for a hike. I was listening to a meditation as I was hiking. I came back. I am just continually doing more to build self-awareness, build self-management, and then the next thing is relationship management. How do you sort of help build those dynamics, and how do you have awareness of other people, right? And I think all of us can do a lot more in that space, and we can ask that of ourselves on a daily basis. Not, oh, I heard someone give a good talk, that's a neat thing, but put it in front of you, whether you journal, whether you keep notes, whatever it is you do, think about working on all of those.
Yeah, and what examples in Game of Thrones did you see illustrating this, or a lack thereof?
Yeah, well, we were talking about Tyrion, so he certainly has it. Jon Snow really has it early on in some pretty critical ways. When Samwell Tarly is initially, being trained at Castle Black, and he's getting his butt kicked, and he's getting knocked into the dirt, and Jon says, "Well, don't worry, you'll be better tomorrow."
Right.
And he goes, "No, I'm never better." Right? And Jon realizes I've got to help him. So there's an awareness of this other person. There's a decision to build the relationship. Jon goes around and tells everyone, he either threatens people, stop hitting him, or he tries to encourage people to not hit him. And it has a very positive effect, and it builds Samwell Tarly's confidence that someone cares about him enough. And it ends up being a resource that helps all of them, right? So there's an EQ moment where it works, and then I think the most obvious EQ moment where Jon drops the ball is when he has this brilliant strategic idea of bringing the wildlings across the wall to get them away from the White Walkers, get them away from being turned into, zombified, a weapon, right? And he loves the idea. He knows it's the right idea. He knows he's got no choice. He tells all of his people, and a lot of them don't buy into it.
Right.
And he basically just says, tough, I'm the leader, and this is what we're doing. And that would have been a moment. I realized that he was under incredible pressure. Literally the wildlings were coming up saying, they're behind us.
Right.
Get in and lock the gates. I mean, they're coming. But he needed somewhere in there to acknowledge that to himself in self-awareness, my people don't agree, and then the self-management piece would be, what can I do to try to create some better relationship with them? And instead, he makes a decision I think many of us do when we're in leadership roles. He goes, the clock's ticking, I have no choice, I'm right, they're wrong, and he goes with his choice, and then he ends up getting assassinated.
Right. I remember there's a scene where a boy says to Jon Snow something like, "The wildlings killed my mother,
That's
my
Ollie,
father,
yeah.
Ollie,
Yeah.
my cousins, everyone." And it's this very emotional
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
And then I think John replies to him with a logical argument of,
Yeah.
"Well, I know, but
Yeah.
what could a leader do to be more persuasive?"
Yeah, I mean,
Because this is like the crux of leadership is getting buy-in.
Yeah, exactly. At that moment when Ollie's talking to him, it can't be logical. It's emotional, and you can't force the person to see your side. It's got to be persuasion, right? It's got to be a moment of, I understand, Ollie, and that was a horrible thing. And amongst those wildlings was a woman I loved, and I myself struggle with understanding how they could go and reave and murder innocent people like your family. And it's been done. And honestly, both of our sides have been doing this back and forth for 1,000 years. And it's horrible. And the price your parents paid is horrible. We're in a situation now where if we leave them on that side and the White Walkers kill them and turn them into whites, there's a greater chance all of us are going to die, including all the families that haven't been killed yet. I can't make you decide to accept my agreement, but I'd like you to think about it, and then I'd like you to come back to me. We don't have much time because I'm sealing the walls in, half a day. Go and think about it and come back to me and let me know if there's more we can talk about. Right? And I think he's got to put it out there as an invitation and allow Ollie and the other people, Sir Alistair Thorne and the different people that were against him, he has to give them a choice to come back and communicate with him.
Right.
And he has to recognize that they have to choose to follow him. If he's forcing them, now clearly in military situations, when the house is on fire and you're like, get out of the house. I mean, there's times you have to make that decision. But at this moment, he had to try to expand time and build their either willingness to follow ship or accept them pushing back up until... And maybe at the final moment would have been him calling in other soldiers and arresting them and putting them in the cell. I mean, maybe he would have had to do that. But what he tried to do was pretend it wasn't going to, he tried to pretend it was going to go away.
Yeah.
And we can't do that in leadership.
Yeah.
Because those things don't go away, particularly when they're emotional. People just smile at you and then walk off and talk amongst themselves.
True. Yeah. So then John gets assassinated, but he has this big resurrection. What do we learn from that as leaders? What's that all about?
I love all these questions. They're just great. That moment to me is so wonderful when he comes back to life and the Onion Knight is with him. And the Onion Knight to me is another strong example of emotional intelligence all the way through the story. He's always trying to lead people by building kind of relationships, by talking to them honestly. He's trying his best constantly, and he's very focused on other people and what he can do. And at that moment, John says, listen, I did everything I could. I got knifed in the heart for it. I think he says Ollie knifed me in the heart for it. And the Onion Knight, Sir Davos says, look, your job is to go clean up the shit, just get back to it and keep doing it. And to me, that kind of advice from the wrong person, hey, your job's to go clean up the shit, get back and do it. You'd be like, well, fuck you, no, I don't want to do it, right?
Right.
But the way Sir Davos delivers it to him, it's a very human kind of encouragement. Like, this is a tough environment we're in, and it's not going to get any less tough. And to get back all the way to your question of can we just take a pause? Absolutely. Could John have taken a pause right there, and would Davos have been okay with it? Sure. But if John wanted to walk away and was attempting to walk away, and Davos said, you can't do that. We need you, right? And what happens with John is he goes to see, if I've got all this right in my memory, he goes to see Daenerys for the first time, and then he finds out Bran and Sansa are alive, And recognizing that they're alive gives him the motivation to step back into the fray. And I think often in leadership, if we're in a leadership position, if we can understand what motivates people to step back in the fray, that's a great thing.
Yeah.
You get back to Henry V when he's saying, listen, years from now, everyone's going to raise their glasses and wish they were with us right now about to fight the French, because we have this moment to face this huge thing and be remembered for it. He understood that people will do a lot of things because of the legacy.
Absolutely.
Anyway, went off to another writer, but
Yeah, it's great. Well, Bruce, before I ask my last question, where should people look for you online?
my website is www.cravenleadership.com. I'm on Instagram at LEDSOFA. That's Lead Sofa, my vintage Mercury that I used to tool around in Hollywood. The book is available everywhere, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. I did the audio myself, which was quite an adventure. And it's on iTunes and on Audible and that sort of thing. So yeah, I'd love to hear from people. To me, networking is a huge part of education and of my effort to try to reach out to people with good ideas. So I'm always open to hearing from people and doing anything I can to support their efforts.
Excellent. Well, we'll put links to all that stuff in the show notes for anybody who's listening.
Thanks, Brendan.
And on the topic of networking, too, I heard about you at a Columbia alumni event in downtown, and somebody had a magazine with an article that you'd written about the book and stuff. And if you ever wanted to come and speak to that group, I told people last night I was at another event, and they were like, oh, we got to meet this guy. So maybe that's something we could talk about after.
Yeah, I would love to do that.
Cool.
That's anything that gets me to downtown is cool. I like that.
Great,
So.
great.
Awesome.
Well, Bruce, my final question is, how can a leader use fiction to guide their teams?
Yeah. When I started teaching this class 8-9 years ago, I wasn't really sure how it would work, but I thought, people have been using business cases for decades, and novelists, playwrights, screenwriters, they're storytellers at the top of their game. I mean, that's how they make a living. And it's because they're good at what they do. These stories resonate, and if you want to get to Game of Thrones, George R.R. Martin is a master at creating fascinating characters, who struggle against adversity and who have internal doubts and have external threats. And when we engage with these characters in Game of Thrones, we'll remember them when we're under pressure. I mean, I know it works for me. When I'm under pressure, I think, hey, dude, this is a time to be like Tyrion when he listened to Lord Varys and he went to Meereen. Or I'll say, Bruce, this is a moment where have the courage of Arya. She doesn't know how she's going to make it through this, but this is, and so these metaphors are within us and they're easy to access. And what I've attempted to do in this book is connect them to very important applicable ideas. So to me, the power of leadership through fiction is that it's easy to access, it connects us with brilliant thought leaders, and it gives us tools when we're under pressure to choose to win and not die.
Beautiful. Bruce, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Brendan. It's been great.
Hey, everybody, if you enjoyed this episode with Bruce Craven, it would be fantastic if you would give us a review on the Apple Podcast platform, or if you're watching this on YouTube, to like and leave a comment. Let us know what you think. Thanks.